Welcome to this explainer, Articles of Confederation Explained. Since we all know the story of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, today we're skipping the basic background and diving straight into the nuts and bolts of the United States' very first governing document. We're going to break down its structure, its strengths, and of course, its critical weaknesses.
Here is a quick roadmap of where we're headed today. We'll start with the birth of a confederacy, look at the framework and state sovereignty, cover the powers granted to Congress, and then the powers withheld and weaknesses. Finally, we'll trace the road to reform and wrap up with the historical impact and summary.
All right, Part 1. Birth of a Confederacy, Origins of the Articles. Let's dive right into how this document came together to bind a newly independent nation during a time of immense, and I mean immense, uncertainty. Think back to July 1775. The Continental Congress is already taking unified actions, like appointing Benjamin Franklin as the first Postmaster General. Pretty cool, right? A year later, independence is declared. But the states needed a formal agreement to actually govern their new union, which led to the creation of the Articles. Now, notice that 12-year gap between 1775 and the Constitutional Convention in 1787. That was a long, incredibly difficult period of trying to keep the country afloat under this initial system.
Moving on to Part 2, Framework and State Sovereignty, a firm league of friendship. To understand the core philosophy here, we really have to look at the founders' highly intentional distribution of power. It's absolutely crucial to define what a confederacy actually meant for these states back then. As historical records emphasize, a confederation is an alliance where sovereignty resides in each individual state. Actually, let's contrast that with a corporate union, where states act as mere subdivisions of a centralized headquarters. In this confederate system, each state was essentially operating as its own independent country. Just listen to this quote from Article 2. It placed paramount importance on state independence. Pay close attention to the phrase, expressly delegated. If a power wasn't explicitly, literally written down as belonging to the United States and Congress assembled, there was no wiggle room. It belonged entirely to the individual sovereign state. Furthermore, Article 3 established what they called a firm league of friendship. Sounds a bit quaint to us today, doesn't it? But it was dead serious. The states bound themselves together for common defense, mutual welfare, and the security of their liberties. They basically pledged to have each other's backs against any attacks. It was an alliance built strictly on mutual preservation.
Section 3, Powers Granted to Congress. The United States in Congress assembled. So, with sovereignty so fiercely guarded by the states, what powers were actually handed over to this central government?
Congress was granted some very specific but limited powers under Article 9. They had the sole and exclusive right to declare war and peace, send and receive ambassadors, and enter into treaties. Domestically, they could regulate the alloy and value of coin, fix standard weights and measures, run the post offices, and manage Indian affairs. Basically, these were the bare minimum powers required to function as a united front on the global stage. Look at the delicate balance of power when it came to shared military responsibilities. When land forces were raised by a state for common defense, the state legislature got to appoint all officers at or below the rank of colonel. Congress, they only got to appoint the higher-ranking officers and naval commanders. You can see how power was carefully, almost surgically, segmented to keep the central government from getting too strong.
Which brings us to Section 4, Powers Withheld and Weaknesses, Structural Limitations. Let's explore the specific powers intentionally withheld from Congress to prevent centralized control and how those limitations created some profound, everyday challenges.
When evaluating the system objectively, the pros and cons were incredibly stark. For a lot of people, the strengths were fantastic. Delegates to Congress served only one-year terms and could be recalled by their state at any time, for any reason. That meant no career politicians. However, the operational weaknesses were just severe. The biggest one? Congress literally couldn't lay taxes. They could only estimate expenses and politely ask the states to levy the taxes themselves.
And then there's this crucial number, 9. A supermajority of 9 out of 13 states was required for Congress to engage in war, enter into treaties, coin money, borrow funds, or even determine the budget for national defense. You can only imagine the immense gridlock this caused. Getting 9 out of 13 independent-minded states to agree on anything was an absolute nightmare.
Get this. Here is another staggering limitation. If you search the entire text of the Articles of Confederation, the word judicial appears exactly one time. 1. There was absolutely no federal judiciary, no Supreme Court to declare what was constitutional or to resolve massive disputes between states. The entire system relied on states essentially pinky promising to give full faith and credit to the court proceedings of other states. Section 5. The Road to Reform calls for a new constitution. Because of these massive operational hurdles, about 10 years in, the tide began to shift heavily toward reform. All of these compounding administrative headaches led wealthy and influential individuals to start calling for a constitutional convention in 1787. This drive was heavily motivated by interests that desired a federal judiciary and stronger central control. They wanted to manage the general interests of the United States more conveniently, moving away from those completely decentralized pockets of power.
But as the historical records show, there was significant, fierce opposition to a new constitution. Thomas Jefferson wasn't even there. He was on a diplomatic mission in France. Patrick Henry, he flat out refused to attend the convention, famously stating he smelled a rat. Many leaders, like George Mason, fundamentally opposed the introduction of a superior federal judiciary. They were terrified a centralized government would dilute state sovereignty, destroy common law property rights, and just completely run over the interest of the minority. Finally, Section 6, Historical Impact and Summary, Stepping Stone to the Constitution. Despite the fierce opposition, we know the reform movement eventually succeeded. Let's wrap up by looking at the enduring legacy of this highly debated framework. Ultimately, the Articles successfully created a perpetual union that tested the highly challenging waters of self-governance. It fiercely protected state sovereignty, keeping power as close to the individual as possible. But in the end, its glaring functional weaknesses highlighted the structural needs of a growing nation, which directly paved the way for the 1787 Constitution. Looking back, this original framework leaves us with a truly enduring question. In a nation built on fierce independence, how much centralized power is too much? And honestly, aren't we still fighting that exact same battle today? It's definitely something to think about. But to sum it all up, the Articles of Confederation established the first framework of government for the newly independent states and laid the foundation for future constitutional development.